I want to walk through exactly what happened over the following 10 days, because I think the specific sequence matters enormously for understanding what Kayla did not fully understand about the situation she had just created. That same evening, once Kayla and Preston had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and I began making a specific, very thorough list. Not a list of what I might need to pack for myself, as Kayla had clearly assumed I would begin doing. A list of everything in that house that actually, legally, unambiguously belonged to me. The house itself, obviously. Deed held solely in my name, mortgage paid off entirely 11 years earlier. With no financial claim of any kind held by either Preston or Kayla. The furniture, nearly all of it, chosen and purchased by Gordon and me over 3 decades of marriage, including several antique pieces inherited from my own mother that held genuine sentimental and financial value. The kitchen appliances, all of them, purchased during the 2015 remodel and owned outright. The washer and dryer. The living room television and sound system. The dining room set Gordon had specifically commissioned from a local craftsman the year before he got sick. Even, I realized as I continued the list. The beds Preston and Kayla themselves had been sleeping in for the past 17 months. Purchased by me years before their arrival, originally intended for guest use. The following morning, I called Gordon's and my longtime attorney. A careful, meticulous man named Walter Osey, who had handled our estate planning for over 15 years, and explained everything that had happened. The slow shift in household dynamics, the increasing presumption of ownership, and finally, Kayla's explicit instruction that I begin packing to leave my own home. Colleen, Walter said, once I'd finished, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. This is entirely, unambiguously your house. There is no legal ambiguity here whatsoever. Your son and daughter-in-law have no ownership claim, no tenancy rights beyond what basic landlord law might technically require for proper notice. Certainly no authority to instruct you to vacate a property you own outright. I know that legally, I said. But I think I let the situation drift for so long that somewhere along the way they genuinely stopped seeing it that way. And I stopped correcting them. That's a common pattern in family living arrangements, unfortunately, Walter said. The question now is what you actually want to do. Given that they've explicitly asked you to leave your own home, you have every legal right to instead formally ask them to vacate, on whatever reasonable timeline you choose to set. I sat with that for a long moment. I don't want to simply ask them to leave, Walter. I want them to fully understand exactly whose house this has actually been the entire time. I think there's been a genuine dangerous confusion in this household about what belongs to whom. And I think that confusion needs to be corrected completely, not gently. Over the following several days, working with Walter, I formalized a plan that would accomplish exactly that. I contracted with a professional moving and storage company, arranging for a full-scale move to occur exactly 10 days after Kayla's kitchen conversation, not a partial move of a few of my personal belongings, as she had clearly envisioned when she suggested I start packing, but a comprehensive, itemized removal of every single piece of furniture, every appliance, every item in that house that belonged to me, which was to say, nearly everything in it. I also, on Walter's careful advice, formally served Preston and Kayla with a 30-day notice to vacate the premises, delivered through proper legal channels rather than a casual family conversation. Establishing an unambiguous paper trail that would protect me fully in the unlikely event that either of them attempted any kind of legal challenge to what was, in the end, simply my exercising ownership rights over my own property. I told no one in my family what was actually being planned during those 10 days. I continued living in the house as I had been, cooking dinners, watching Oliver in the evenings, behaving with an outward calm that, I'll admit now, took considerable effort to maintain given the magnitude of what I understood was about to unfold. Preston, notably, mentioned nothing during those 10 days about the conversation Kayla had had with me in the kitchen. I do not know, even now, whether she had fully briefed him on the specifics of what she'd said, or whether he simply preferred not to engage with a conflict he perhaps understood, on some level, reflected poorly on the household dynamic he had allowed to develop under his own roof. I did, during those 10 days, quietly arrange one additional detail that mattered enormously to me on a personal level. Separate from the practical logistics of the move itself, I found, through a careful search and several visits, a lovely two-bedroom condominium 11 minutes away, close enough that I would remain fully present in Oliver's life, but entirely, unambiguously my own space, purchased outright with funds from Gordon's life insurance policy that I had, until this point, left largely untouched. By the morning of the 10th day, everything was in place. My daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen, in my house, and told me to pack my things and go. She smiled when she said it, like she was doing me a favor. So I smiled back, picked up my clipboard, and started packing everything. She had no idea what everything actually meant until the moving truck showed up. I am 60 years old, and I have learned that some people will only ever understand what belongs to you once they watch it being carried out the door. My name is Colleen Ashby. I have lived in my house, a spacious 4-bedroom colonial on Maplecrest Drive in a quiet suburb outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for 26 years, ever since my late husband, Gordon. And I bought it together back when our son Preston was still in elementary school. Gordon passed away 5 years ago from complications following a long illness, and in the years since, I have lived in that house alone, keeping it exactly as we built it together. The kitchen we remodeled ourselves in 2015, the garden I've tended every spring since Preston was a boy, the furniture Gordon and I chose piece by piece over 3 decades of careful, deliberate homemaking. Preston is 32 now, married 4 years ago to a woman named Kayla, and for most of their relationship, I genuinely believed I liked her. She was warm in the early years, complimentary of my cooking, eager to be included in family gatherings, in a way that felt, at the time, like a daughter-in-law genuinely trying to build a relationship with her husband's mother. I want to be fair in how I tell this story, because I think it matters. I did not dislike Kayla from the start. What happened between us developed slowly, over roughly 2 years, in a way that I did not fully understand until it had already reshaped nearly every corner of my own home. The arrangement began 18 months ago, when Preston lost his job in a round of corporate layoffs and Kayla, 6 months pregnant at the time with their first child, was between contracts in her own freelance design work. Facing a genuine financial crisis, they asked if they could move in with me temporarily, just until Preston found new work and they could stabilize enough to afford their own place again. I said yes immediately, without hesitation. Because that is what mothers do when their children need help, and because the idea of my house filling back up with life, especially with a grandchild on the way, felt, in that moment, like an unexpected gift rather than an imposition. I want to be honest about how genuinely happy those first several months were. Preston and Kayla moved into the 2 guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor. My grandson Oliver was born 4 months later, and for a while, my house felt more full and alive than it had, since Preston himself was a teenager still living under my roof. I helped with the baby constantly, gladly, waking at odd hours, learning again the specific rhythms of newborn care I hadn't practiced in over 3 decades. The shift, when I look back on it now, happened so gradually that I genuinely did not notice it accumulating in real time. It began with small things. Kayla rearranging the living room furniture, just to see how it would look, without asking me first, moving pieces Gordon and I had chosen together into configurations that made the room feel, subtly but unmistakably, less like mine. Then came the kitchen, where Kayla began reorganizing cabinets according to her own preferences, replacing dishware I'd used for decades with newer pieces she'd ordered online, framed always as improvements rather than intrusions. By the time Preston found new work again, 8 months after they'd first moved in, the conversation about them finding their own place again had strangely, simply stopped happening. I brought it up gently, once, around the 10-month mark, and Kayla's response left an impression I didn't fully process at the time, as significant as it actually was. "Oh, we've kind of just settled in here, honestly," she said, with a light, easy laugh that suggested the matter was entirely uncomplicated. "It just makes more sense with Oliver, honestly. Why would we go pay rent somewhere else when there's so much space here already? Plus you love having us, right?" I did love having them, genuinely, and so I let the matter drop, telling myself that a slightly extended stay, given the practical benefits for everyone involved, was a reasonable, generous thing to offer my son's young family. Over the following months, the dynamic in my own house continued shifting in ways that, looking back now, I recognize as a slow, steady erosion of my own sense of ownership over the space I had lived in for over 2 decades. Kayla began referring to our kitchen, our living room, in casual conversation with friends who visited, language that Preston, notably, never corrected. She hosted a baby shower for a friend in my backyard without asking me first, simply informing me the week before that we're having people over Saturday. She began making decisions about the household, what groceries to buy, how the thermostat should be set, which contractor to hire for a bathroom repair, with an authority that I slowly realized had come to exceed my own in the very house I owned outright, mortgage-free, in my own name. I want to explain why I let this happen for as long as I did. Because I think the answer matters. I loved having my grandson close. I loved, genuinely, having my house feel full and alive again after years of solitary quiet following Gordon's death. And some part of me, I think, mistook the slow erosion of my own authority in my own home for a kind of generous flexibility, a mother's willingness to bend for her son's young family, rather than recognizing it, clearly, for what it actually was, the moment that finally, fully clarified, everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in April, nearly 17 months after Preston and Kayla had first moved in. I came home from a doctor's appointment to find Kayla standing in my kitchen. My kitchen, with its cabinets I had chosen myself, its counters Gordon and I had installed together, over a difficult, exhausting weekend in 2015, holding a printed listing for a house 3 streets over, clearly excited about something. Colleen. Perfect timing, she said, barely looking up from her phone. So, we've been thinking, and honestly, at this point, we think it's probably best if you start looking into some other living arrangements. Maybe a smaller place. Or one of those senior communities, something more your size now, that it's really just you again. We're thinking of converting the whole downstairs, opening up the layout, really making this feel like our own space finally. Especially with a second baby on the way, I stood in my own kitchen absorbing this, genuinely uncertain for a moment whether I had heard her correctly. Kayla, this is my house. I mean technically, sure, she said. Still scrolling through something on her phone, her tone carrying the particular breezy dismissiveness of someone, entirely confident she was not saying anything unreasonable. But realistically, you're one person rattling around in this huge place, and we're a growing family who actually needs the space. It just makes more sense this way, don't you think? We were thinking maybe you could start packing up some things this week. Get a head start on finding somewhere smaller. She smiled at me as she said it, an easy, untroubled smile, the specific smile of someone who genuinely believed she was proposing something reasonable, even generous. Rather than instructing the actual legal owner of the house to vacate her own home, I looked at her for a long moment, feeling something inside me settle into a clarity I had been circling for months without ever quite letting myself land on it fully. Okay, I said. I'll start packing. The moving trucks arrived at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 3 large vehicles staffed by a professional crew of 6, along with a detailed itemized inventory list Walter and I had prepared over the preceding week, cross-referenced carefully against purchase records, warranties, and, in several cases, decades-old receipts I had kept, out of nothing more than long habit, in a filing cabinet in my study. I stood in my driveway with a clipboard, directing the crew methodically through the house, room by room, as Preston and Kayla, both still in their pajamas, Oliver on Kayla's hip, watching in what I can only describe as escalating, disbelieving horror, stood on the front steps and watched their entire living situation being systematically dismantled in front of them. "Mom," Preston said, his voice climbing toward panic somewhere around the point when the crew began carefully wrapping the dining room table. "Mom, what is happening right now?" "I'm packing," I said calmly, checking an item off my list as 2 crew members carried the living room sofa toward the truck. "Kayla asked me to pack my things and find somewhere else to live. I'm simply making sure I take everything that actually belongs to me before I go." "This is our furniture," Kayla said, her voice sharp now, the easy breeziness of 10 days earlier entirely gone. "No," I said, and I want to be honest that there was a particular satisfaction in the calm, factual clarity with which I was finally able to say this. After 17 months of quietly absorbing the opposite assumption, it isn't. This dining set was commissioned by my late husband in 2009. This sofa was purchased by Gordon and me in 2018. These kitchen appliances were installed during our 2015 remodel, paid for entirely from our joint account. I have documentation for every single item leaving this house today, and none of it, I'm afraid, belongs to either of you. You can't just take everything, Kayla said, her voice rising now, Oliver beginning to fuss at the tension in her arms. Where are we supposed to sleep? What are we supposed to cook on? I would imagine, I said, checking another item off my list as the crew carried out the bedroom set Preston and Kayla had been sleeping on, that you'll need to make your own arrangements, the same way you suggested I do 10 days ago. I've served proper legal notice, through my attorney, giving you 30 days to vacate the premises entirely. That gives you ample time to arrange your own housing, purchase your own furniture, and establish your own household. The exact independence, in fact, that you told me, quite directly, you and Preston were ready for. I watched something shift across Kayla's face in that moment, the specific, dawning realization of a person who has spent months operating under an assumption that has just, irreversibly, been proven catastrophically wrong. Preston, for his part, said very little throughout the entire morning, watching with a kind of stunned, guilty silence as decades of his childhood home were carefully wrapped and carried past him toward the waiting trucks. Near the end of the process, as the crew began loading the final items, my late husband's reading chair, the bookshelves from the study, the grandfather clock that had stood in our front hallway since before Preston was even born, he approached me quietly, away from Kayla, his voice low and genuinely shaken. Mom, I didn't know she was going to say that to you. I mean, I knew things had gotten comfortable, I guess, with us staying longer than we planned. But I didn't know she'd actually tell you to leave your own house. Preston, I said, setting down my clipboard for a moment to look at my son directly. You've lived in this house for 17 months. You watched your wife slowly take over every room in it, watched her tell your own mother, in her own kitchen, to pack up and find somewhere smaller to live. And in 17 months, you never once corrected the assumption that this had somehow become your household to reorganize as you both saw fit. I don't think you not knowing the specific words she used to me changes very much about what you allowed to happen under this roof. He didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't expect one. I finished directing the crew, signed the final inventory paperwork, and by early afternoon drove away from the house on Maple Crest Drive for what would be, I understood clearly, the last time I would ever live there. Though not, I was equally clear, the last time I would ever set foot inside it as Oliver's grandmother. It has been 7 months now since that Saturday morning, and I want to tell this part of the story honestly, because I think it deserves an honest accounting rather than a simple, satisfying conclusion. Preston and Kayla did, ultimately, vacate the house within the 30-day window Walter had formally established, moving into a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town, furnished, out of what I understand was genuine financial necessity, largely with second-hand pieces and a handful of new purchases they could not entirely afford at once. Preston reached out to me during that difficult transition period several times in conversations that felt, for the first time in nearly 2 years, genuinely honest, rather than shaped by an unspoken assumption of unconditional accommodation. I think I let a lot slide because it was just easier, he told me during one of these conversations, sitting across from me at a coffee shop, roughly 6 weeks after the move. Easier than having hard conversations with Kayla about what was actually reasonable to expect from you. Easier than acknowledging, even to myself, how much we'd started taking for granted. I'm sorry, Mom, genuinely. Not just for what she said that day, but for the 17 months of stuff before it that made her feel like she could say it in the first place. I appreciated the honesty, and I told him so, though I was also careful, in that conversation and in the months that followed, not to rush back into the kind of unexamined generosity that had allowed the entire situation to develop as it had. I love my son. I love my grandson, whom I still see regularly, now on terms I set myself rather than terms that simply accumulated around me unnoticed, but I have learned at 60 years old. That love without clear boundaries is not actually generosity. It is simply an invitation for those boundaries to be quietly erased by whoever benefits most from their absence. Kayla and I have spoken only twice since that Saturday morning. Both brief, careful conversations focused entirely on practical matters related to Oliver's care and scheduling. I do not know whether she has genuinely reflected on what happened, or whether she has simply filed the entire episode away as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a consequence of her own choices. I have decided, for my own peace, that I do not need to know the answer to that question in order to move forward with my own life clearly and honestly. I love my condominium, 11 minutes from Maple Crest Drive. Filled now with the same furniture Gordon and I chose together over 3 decades of marriage, arranged exactly as I want it, in a space that answers to no one's preferences but my own. I see Oliver twice a week, on a schedule I established myself, in a relationship that has, if anything, grown more genuinely cherished now that it exists entirely on my own terms, rather than as a byproduct of an arrangement I never fully consented to in the first place. I am 60 years old. I built a life with a man I loved for 30 years, raised a son inside a home we made together, and then watched, gradually and almost imperceptibly, as that home slipped out of my own hands into an assumption of ownership I had never actually granted anyone. When I was finally told plainly and with an easy smile to pack my things and go, I did exactly that, but I made certain, this time, that everyone in that house finally understood, with total clarity, exactly what everything had always actually meant. People sometimes ask me if I regret the way I handled that final morning. The trucks, the itemized list. The public unraveling of an assumption Kayla had clearly never expected to be challenged knows completely. I tell them the truth, I do not regret a single moment of it. I had spent 17 months quietly allowing my own home to be redefined by someone else's confidence rather than my own clarity. That Saturday morning was not revenge. It was simply finally, the truth, carried out the door, one carefully documented item at a time.